Welcome to Lawton Online with your host, Andrew Lawton. He's locked, loaded, and ready to fire. Lawton Online starts right now.
Hello and welcome to you, my friends. This is Lawton Online on TheRebel.Media. That makes me, Andrew Lawton, your host for our next little while as we delve into the annals of all that matters in the world, all that makes the world tick, and we try to solve all of the world's problems. I know it's a bold and ambitious plan, but, well, I've done more. So we'll see how it goes. I kid, but it is great to have you joining me because I was off last week. If you didn't miss the podcast, well, tough luck. If you did miss the podcast, then I'm glad that you at least noticed I was gone. I was actually in Israel, and I was there on a media delegation sponsored by the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs. And I'm going to talk a fair bit this show about Israel and about a lot of the things that came up during my time there. But I also wanted to tie that into what is easily the biggest story outside of Israel, the biggest story in the world this week, and that's what happened in Paris. And believe it or not, these are not independent of one another. These are not stories that don't exist on the same plane. These are stories that, as a matter of fact, are entirely related to one another. And that's why I'm actually glad that I get to talk about them all in a very long-form way. I don't need to worry about commercial breaks. I can really just go and tell you a little bit about why I think, and more importantly, why you should think that these are all related to one another. Now, to start off, I have to tell you a little bit about what it was that I was doing in Israel. So I mentioned that it was a media delegation. There were a small handful of other Canadian journalists there. We had people in radio, people in print, people in television, and what we were trying to do was get a sense of what Israel is. Unfortunately, Israel, despite all of its publicity and all of the attention it gets in the world, is very much a one-dimensional state to a lot of people. People don't understand Israel outside of Israel-Palestine affairs. People don't understand Israel outside of the realm of rockets flying through the air. So it's something that I actually had a level of difficulty with because I'm not a shy person at all. I'm not the kind of person who shies away from things, and I'm also not the type of person who's necessarily brave. I don't, run headfirst into the fire, but I also am not the kind of person that likes to run away from things. But I didn't think there was any bravery at all in going to Israel. I didn't think there was any bravery at all in visiting a country I've seen before, by the way. It's not my first time there, with a bunch of other people from Canada. There's no bravery in that. But the way people were interacting with me, the way people were corresponding with me, you'd think I was signing my life away by going there. You'd think that I was basically signing my own death warrant by going to Israel. People just associate that country with fear, with terror, with panic. And when I announced that I was going a couple of weeks beforehand, people were like, oh my gosh, are you sure? Are you serious? Why are you doing this? Why do that? Why do that to yourself? And these are not dumb people, by the way. These are not fear-mongering people. These are not people who overreact to anything. This is just what our collective media understanding and our collective awareness of Israel has done to us. We assume that it's a dangerous place. And I'm not blind to the realities of the world. I know there have been acts of terror that have been committed in Israel as recently as a few days ago. Stabbings are the new tool of the terrorist sympathizers in the Jewish state of Israel. But when all is said and done, that is not, in my eyes anyway, the real Israel. That's not a defining characteristic of what happens in that country on a daily basis. So not only were people warning me, cautioning me, a few people tried to talk me out of it. And I'm like, screw you, I'm going to Israel. I want the week off work. I want to go. I want to enjoy it. And more importantly, I want to see it. But then we have the ultimate twist. And I'm not happy about this, by the way. I don't like that this happened, but I also would be remiss if I didn't notice that it happened. People all over the country, supporters, listeners, even friends and family, telling me not to go to Israel, telling me it's not safe, telling me something could happen. We were walking back from our hotel on Friday night, or to our hotel, rather. We had just had a wonderful dinner out in Tel Aviv. It was coming down to the final day of the trip. We would be leaving in just a couple of days. And then we get the alerts that there's been a terrorist attack in Paris. I think it was around 10 or 11 p.m. Israel time when we found out what had happened, and we were still getting information coming through. I didn't have my phone on over there because of roaming, so every time I was on Wi-Fi, I would get a slew of updates. And that was what was happening. And this happened while I was comfortably eating food, sipping wine, chatting with friends, chatting with locals in a city that other people view as one of the most dangerous in the world, in a country that other people view as one of the most dangerous in the world. But there we were, safe, enjoying our food, enjoying our drink, enjoying each other's company. Well, 130 people lay dead in the streets of Paris. And that's a very, very important thing to note for perspective here, which is that in 2015, to borrow from Justin Trudeau, because it's 2015, in 2015, terrorism is a reality. Terrorism is a legitimate threat. But it can also happen absolutely anywhere. Terrorism can get you wherever you are. It can get you in Ottawa, Ontario, in Parliament Hill. It can get you in Paris, France, in a sports arena, and it can get you in the streets of Jerusalem on Ben Yehuda Street, where I was just one day before a stabbing last week on that street took place. It can happen absolutely anywhere. And this means it's important to look at counterterrorism. It means it's important to have a sense of where the world's problems are, problem regions, problem ideologies. It's important to have all of that, but it means that we can't live in fear. I'm not saying that Israel is the safest place in the world. I know bad things have happened there. I also think they're overinflated in terms of their frequency. It's a small country geographically, but still, the fact that only a couple of people are hit by the most low-tech form of attacks possible suggests that what the Israeli government is doing to curb terrorism is in fact working. Israeli airport security is legendary and quite effective. And ultimately, I think we're going to see more attempts and more failures in Israel because Israel has been aware of its status as a resident in the war of terror and terror's enemies. Israel has been fighting this. You look at France. François Hollande, the president of France, declares in a bold and defiant way that he will fight back, that he wants to strip terrorists of citizenship, that the French people are not going to sit down idly and take this. They're not going to take it lying down. And as much as my heart went out for the people of France, my heart went out to the victims, my heart went out to anyone involved or anyone who felt afraid after that, I had to shake my head at the idea that this was at all a surprise. I was surprised and shocked, I might add, that anyone in Paris, anyone in France, didn't believe that this could happen, given what France's foreign policy has looked like in the last decade. How could anyone be shocked that this happened, yet there people were? So it's one thing in the wake of an attack to be bold and defiant as Hollande was. It's quite another to be living with that fear on a daily basis and having to govern as though that is a viable and legitimate threat. And that's what Israel has had to do. Now, I realize I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth here because on one hand, I'm trying to say that there's an Israel beyond the conflict, and there is. We tried wine, we embraced the culture, we saw artistic performances, we saw young people, old people, secular Jews, Orthodox Jews, other religious Jews, we saw it all. So yes, there is an Israel beyond the conflict, but Israel's place in the world is in large part defined by the conflict. And I'm going to play in the next segment an interview with Haviv Rettig Gur, who's a journalist with the Times of Israel, and we're going to be talking about Israel's place in the world. The support and detraction that Israel, I'll say, enjoys, or certainly experiences, from allies and so-called allies around the world. Places like Canada on a more positive note, places like the United States on a less positive note. But it comes back to a fundamental question of why we need, as a freedom-loving country, to support Israel. And it's the same reason we, as a freedom-loving country, need to oppose terrorism. Israel's enemies are terrorists. Israel has its public relations enemies. It's countries like Syria. But its real enemies, its militant enemies, are terrorists. Hamas, Hezbollah, these are organizations who want the obliteration of Israel, want the obliteration of the Jewish people. And these are very real enemies for the state of Israel and for the Jewish people. And I'm not sure that the progressive, freedom-loving, or should I say, claiming to be freedom-loving progressives, actually realize the very real violent threats that are facing Israelis every day. So I go back to what I mentioned a few moments ago. There I was walking back to the hotel after having a wonderful dinner in Tel Aviv. Life went on. Because this is not a foreign concept to the people of Israel. It's not a new idea that there are terrorist attacks, that blood is shed, that there are casualties, because they've had to live with this for years. And the world only seems to care when the world is the one experiencing it. They don't care when this is happening to Israelis in the street. They don't care when this is happening to innocent Jews, to an 80-year-old woman, to children, to teens. They only care when it happens to their own. And that was what it took. That was what it took for Holland to take the threat of terrorism seriously, for it to happen on his soil. But even in spite of that, there are still people who are not prepared to acknowledge that terrorism is a real threat. I turn to comments made by Stéphane Dion, Canada's new minister responsible for foreign affairs, who said in a shocking comment just this week, as a matter of fact, that climate change poses a bigger threat than terrorism. Now, this shouldn't surprise me. In fact, shame on me that it does surprise me. But we heard during the campaign Justin Trudeau say that his first thing that he was going to do as prime minister, he said this on CTV Atlantic, his first priority, his very, very first priority was going to be to get ready for Paris, to get ready for the UN's climate change summit in Paris. That was going to be his first priority. And you know what? At least his cabinet's talking points are not disappointing. Because when push comes to shove, now his foreign affairs minister says that terrorism is less of a threat than climate change. Now, how many people are dead because of climate change in the streets? I take issue with the idea that climate change even exists in the way that we're told by the left it does. But even if it did, apart from a couple of melting ice cubes and melting ice sculptures, I'm not sure we can say that there has been the death toll that terrorism has had. And it doesn't end, by the way, with Dion. No, not at all. Because Ralph Goodale, also a member of the cabinet of Justin Trudeau, Ralph Goodale has said there's no reason to touch Canada's terror alert level. It's staying exactly where it was last October when the Parliament Hill shooting took place by Michael Zehoff-Bibo, also a terrorist who attacked Canada not only on Canadian soil, but in Canada's seat of government. Now, compared to Paris, what happened in Ottawa then, it was negligible. One casualty. Don't get me wrong, one is too many, but still, as far as terror attacks go, we got off easy compared to what other countries have had to contend with. But even that didn't drive home the belief to the Trudeau government that terrorism is a real threat. What will it take to take it seriously? What will it take to recognize that this is a real force in the world? And it's interesting how misguided the priorities are, because here we are now looking at a refugee quote-unquote crisis. And by the way, I don't know that there is a refugee crisis. There's a refugee discussion. There's a refugee quandary, even. There's no crisis. The question becomes, can Canada bring in 25,000 Syrian refugees by the end of December? That's 6 weeks away, 6 weeks until New Year's. Can Canada bring in 25,000 refugees safely and securely? Trudeau says yes. Color me a little bit skeptical. I don't buy it. I think instead of focusing on a number and a date, we should say that Canada will work as quickly as possible to bring in as many refugees as we can, keeping with the integrity of our security screening and our own national security and sovereignty. The fact that there's now a quota attached is very much like his cabinet. He's focusing on numbers over substance, numbers over actual aptitudes, and I think in the end, it's Canada that loses when you do something like that. So what we're looking at here, what we're going to see anyway, is a turning point, if you will. A turning point in which people will start to realize, because they'll have to realize, that this has nothing to do with refugees, that has nothing to do with trying to make the world a better place, and everything to do with trying to distract from the real issues, because we're already seeing it. We're already seeing it. People are expressing their leeriness, if you will, about refugees and saying as a result, well, we don't have an issue with refugees. This is what I'm hearing from people on the right. We don't have an issue with refugees. We want to make sure that Canada keeps itself protected. And then what does the left do? The left says that's fear-mongering. The left says we're trying to fan the flames of fear that exist in the wake of terrorism. But then they also say in the same breath that terrorism isn't a threat. That there should be no fear because, well, you know what? Terrorism doesn't exist. There's just crime and, well, you know, sometimes it might suck a little bit, but we'll get through it. Yeah, we'll get through it. And I'm looking, trying and searching to find an answer for how people could be so blind and be so ignorant. I want to make something abundantly clear. I do not believe there is a perfect solution to the refugee quandary. I don't believe we can, being a freedom-loving nation, just let people die in their own countries. I also don't believe that we can pass the buck to others because, look, that's what Justin Trudeau is trying to do with Canada's military efforts in northern Iraq and Syria. He's trying to say, let other people pick up the slack. So I don't want to say, as a Canadian, to let other people pick up the slack on refugees. If you believe there is a refugee issue, you should be prepared to let Canada put our money where our mouth is. Because let's face it, we have money. We do have money. And the question becomes, how much do we do? Do we open our borders completely? Absolutely not. Do we open up indiscriminately? Absolutely not. We've already seen that the refugee influx has been used as cover for people who are trying to get into countries on falsified passports. There are still reports, outstanding, but still reports that one of the Paris terrorists entered the country as a refugee. You have the issue of no closed borders within Europe, so once you're in, you're in. And the same is true of Canada. You go in one port in Canada, and all of a sudden you have access to the entire country. But then we have the more concerning questions here. And I think these are the questions that I would love to hear an answer from. You can email me any time of the day, andrew@andrewlawton.ca. Why are we only hearing about the refugee issue now? I remind you that no one in Canada, not a single major voice in politics or in media or even in the left-wing advocacy world, was talking about refugees until September. Not a single person was talking about this as though it was an integral issue to Canada until September 5th, I believe. That was the day that we woke up to the photograph of young Alan Kurdi at 3 years old lying face down on a beach in Turkey. And that dramatically changed the Canadian election campaign. It dramatically changed the Canadian discussion. It changed the discussion in the world and made people all of a sudden aware that there were Syrian refugees trying to flee Assad. And the grievances are legitimate, by the way. I don't think we can say, well, you know what, he's just misunderstood, and I'm sure you can go back and try to make peace with him. But that was the photo that changed everything, yet changed nothing at the same time. Because it didn't mark a turning of the page, it didn't mark any new developments, it marked people all of a sudden being less ignorant than they were the day before. And everyone wants to believe that the country will open its doors and open its borders. No one wants to open up their own living rooms. No one wants to open up their own bedrooms. I shouldn't say no one. There are lots of church groups that are prepared, and mosques and synagogues as well, to put their money where their mouths are. But I have to wonder why guilt has been such a driving force in this discussion. Why guilt has become such a leading player in the refugee quandary. It's not a crisis. I have to remind you what I said earlier. It is, in fact, a quandary. Why? Well, the answer is simple, because we're humans. When we're no longer able to be ignorant to the problems of the world, we try to find the easiest possible solutions, and that is writing a Facebook comment saying the government needs to do more. And I agree the government does need to do more. More to vet, more to secure, more to protect. And there's been somewhat of a meme circulating the internet in the last few days that I find kind of unique, and it's that if someone gives you a bowl of 25,000 M&Ms and 25 of them are poisoned, will you let your family eat from that bowl? And I don't think the metaphor makes any sort of big, bold point. I think it is an interesting one, though. Certainly it's thought-provoking. But I'd go to a different metaphor, if that's the game we're playing here, to understand some of the issues with the refugee crisis. And I'd ask the question of, why is it our problem? And that's if you think it is our problem. And I think that you could argue both sides of that. I am not opposed to having a humanitarian role in the world, but I am opposed to doing it at the expense of our own people, both in terms of safety and in terms of service. But the other question is, how can you deal with a leaky hose, for example, without dealing with the flow of water in the first place? Sure, you can patch up all the holes you want, but you need to deal with where the water's coming from before you can deal with the actual leaks. And this is what we're not hearing anything about from Trudeau. He wants to talk about Canada's bold humanitarian place in the world. You know, this is the same guy that famously talked about giving advice to withstand a cold winter to the Kurdish in northern Iraq. The same guy who makes jokes about whipping our CF-18s out instead of actually talking about a bold plan for the military. And I'm not trying to rehash the themes of the campaign here. I'm trying to remind you that Trudeau's feel-good way of policymaking here on the refugee issue is a lost cause when he's unwilling to accept that military engagement is needed to end the flow of refugees, to eliminate why refugees are becoming refugees, why people are being displaced from their country. And herein lies the problem. People are also using the metaphor, or the comparison rather, of Jews fleeing Germany during the Holocaust, around the time of World War II. And people are saying, how can we repeat mistakes we've made in the past again? Everyone, I think, agrees that Canada and the West should have done more during the Holocaust, and absolutely that's true. But when we look at that issue, we also responded to Nazi Germany in full force. The Allied forces of the world beating them on the ground, beating them in the air, and beating them in the sea. To a lesser extent, but still, it did happen. So it's amazing how the argument breaks down. People say, well, we brought in the Jews, or we tried to bring in the Jews, or we should have brought in the Jews after the Holocaust. I say, yeah, but we also needed to deal with what was causing them to be persecuted anyway. We actually had to get in and on the ground to liberate them in order to protect them, in order to house them. And by the way, that's only one of the many flaws with the comparison of the Syrian refugee issue to the Holocaust. I don't even want to get into that comparison because it's not a valid nor a fair one. But the question remains, how can we deal with the flow of refugees without dealing with the root source? And here's Justin Trudeau's biggest failing as a prime minister less than 1 month after becoming the prime minister, which is that he is unwilling to utilize the military for anything that involves combat. When I interviewed him in January and asked him under what circumstances would he use the military in a combat role in Canada, I asked him 3 times. He could not give one single example. Could not give one single example wherein he supported using the military. And this was around the height of his opposition to the Northern Iraq mission, to the ISIS mission. Or Daesh, as I'm referring it to, because apparently it offends them a lot more. So we should all call ISIS Daesh, but that's a topic for another show. So where do we go from here? Where do we go from here with the refugee issue? Stay the course. Stay the course is the best advice I can offer, because we can't expedite our timeline because we think it makes a good soundbite of a goal. To say, well, 25,000 by the end of the year sounds good, so let's do that. No. I would rather bring in 50,000, hey, 100,000, why not? Vetted, cleared refugees than even 1,000 that have not gone through the rigorous screening that they could. This is not a question of do you support looking out for your fellow human being. This is not a question of do you support that love conquers evil, because people are only talking about the refugee quandary in platitudes. No, this is an issue of where do we balance our humanitarian goals as a country with our obligations to the people of this country. Where is the balance there and how do we protect it? Because look, if we bring in 25,000 in the next 6 weeks, do we even have the infrastructure for that? Do we even have the facilities to house them while they're processed? Do we even have the resources to deal with that? One of the other memes circulating is one talking about the number of people that are expected to come in by the end of the year in Canada versus the number of people that Pearson Airport clears in a day. Well, the problem is Pearson Airport, A, has the staff, B, are not dealing with the same type of people, C, are checking what's on their person rather than doing comprehensive background checks, and D, and this is the most important one, have had a heck of a lot of time to practice and hone in the skills. Not just someone saying, we're going to do this by December 31st and hope for the best. So the Muslim refugees from Syria are not Pearson Airport travelers. They are not Jewish World War II refugees. And they are not people whose needs trump our security and safety needs. We've seen how few people it takes to launch a large terrorist attack. And yes, we are seeing a group that is fleeing the same regime that we are fighting on the terrorist front. But that old story about the wolf in sheep's clothing is so for a reason. We've got to take a quick break here. When we come back, I'm going to talk a little bit more about Israel. Haviv Rettig Gur will join me from the Times of Israel to talk about Israel's place in the world, and I'll talk a little bit more about my delegation, my media delegation to Israel after the fact as well. You're listening to Lawton Online on TheRebel.Media. I'm Andrew Lawton. Stay tuned.
He's unapologetic, unwavering, and unafraid to take on the left's sacred cows. He's Andrew Lawton, and you're listening to Lawton Online on TheRebel.Media.
Thanks for sticking with me through the break there, folks. Continuing on this episode of Lawton Online, I promised I was going to spend a great deal of the show talking about Israel this time around, and I know I started off the program doing that. And I'm not quite sure what I'll do in the next few weeks. I mean, in a week and a bit there, I had a lot of time to learn and discover things and took some amazing pictures and met some amazing people and did some great interviews. So I don't know what form my coverage of this will take in the next few weeks. I actually want to hear from you. If you want to hear more about Israel, make it somewhat of a month-long series where I devote a little bit of the show every week to Israel issues. Let me know. Otherwise, if you're done with it after this, let me know as well. I'll be very democratic in this respect. Andrew at andrewlawton.ca is my email address. But I did want to talk a little bit about why Israel is so significant, because it is one of the smallest countries in the world. It's occupying a very small space of land compared to certainly North America, compared to a lot of European countries even. But still, it is one of the most significant countries in the world. Historically, politically, religiously, culturally, and in terms of foreign policy as well. I know Dennis Prager in one of his Prager University videos spoke about how if aliens came to Earth and observed one day at the UN, they'd leave thinking that Israel was probably the most important place in the world, the hotbed of civilization. Because it may not occupy a big space in the globe, it occupies a huge space in our minds. And in Canada, we had over the last decade one of the biggest and best track records as being pro-Israel, certainly above any other countries in the world. Justin Trudeau has not yet signaled a formal reversal of what Canada's position on Israel will be, but it stands to reason it will not be as resolute and brazen as it once was. We know that the relationship between the United States and Israel has been a bit rocky. So where are things now? What are we looking towards, or what should we be anticipating as far as that relationship goes? And then there's the more fundamental question: does it even matter? Does how the world view Israel even matter to Israel? So our group, while we were there, had the chance to interact with a number of people, representatives of the Israeli government, Israeli media, representatives of the companies that have had a great level of success in Israel. And one of the people was Haviv Rettig Gur. Now, he is a journalist with the Times of Israel, which is a huge online newspaper, a news site in Israel. And Haviv was chatting with our group about Israel's place in the world and why Israel exists in a way that I don't think a lot of Canadians see. I don't think a lot of people in the West see. You know, Hillary Clinton had wrote an op-ed a week or so ago, maybe it was 2 weeks ago, in which she talked about Israel as an idea, whereas to Israelis, Israel is a country. And I think that as a pro-Israel Canadian, this is something that I've had to check in myself, which is that it's not necessarily enough for people in the world to say, yes, we support the idea of Israel, because Israelis have daily challenges on a day-to-day basis that mean something else. And Haviv actually wrote a piece, and I'll ask him about it in a moment, back in April when he said, Israel doesn't care what you think. Kind of an open letter to the world. So I had the privilege of hearing him over dinner last week at a great restaurant in Jerusalem, and have the privilege of welcoming to the show again Haviv Rettig Gur from the Times of Israel. Haviv, great to have you on the show, sir. Thanks for your time today.
Thank you for having me.
So obviously it's a little bit late there, so I appreciate you joining me in spite of the time difference here. When we talk about the existence of Israel, obviously Israelis live and breathe this. You've lived in the West. You've also lived in Israel before. What would you gauge as being the world's understanding of why there is an Israel, if there even is one?
That's a great question. There are a lot of different reasons. There are a lot of different stories that people tell about Israel. And this happens to other countries, obviously. But I think there's, hopefully it's not an optical illusion because I'm Israeli, so I notice when people talk about Israel more. I think there is something more poignant, more resonant about Israel around the world in the sense that people like to tell the stories of their identities. Many, many people, certainly in the West, certainly in the Muslim world, often use Israel as sort of a shorthand for trying to actually say something about themselves. So, for example, there are these incredibly detailed studies and surveys of anti-Semitic attitudes in the Muslim world. And one of the most fascinating things about those attitudes is that the less contact a Muslim society has with Jews, the more likely it is to be anti-Semitic. In other words, Algerians are much more likely to tell pollsters that they have anti-Semitic attitudes, that they believe bad, negative things about Jews than the Lebanese. And Lebanon and Israel have had wars between them. And yet anti-Semitism is actually lower in Lebanon than it is in Algeria. And that tells us something about what Israel means to Algerians. It obviously doesn't mean anything real. They don't actually have any contact with Israel. And that's true not just in the Muslim world and not just when it comes to anti-Semitism. We've had a lot of experiences in Israel hearing speeches by President Obama, who I think is profoundly a friend of Israel. And I think that in general, American strategic planners, not just elected presidents, but the Pentagon and everybody all the way on down, because Israel has proven itself as an ally, and because so many other potential allies in the Middle East have either collapsed or, switched to the Soviets during the Cold War, or just aren't as dependable as Israel. Israel really is seen as objectively valuable an ally to the United States. But when President Obama talks about Israel, he doesn't talk about strategy. He doesn't talk about stability. He doesn't talk about a refueling base in the Middle East, or an ally that'll never turn away from America in the important issues. He talks about things like, I know that the dream of Israel is a dream that, means we have to now negotiate with the Palestinians in a particular way or do some other policy issue. And, there's this engagement with Israel as a moral narrative in the West, in the Muslim world, in Europe, that I don't even know how to express this. You mentioned my piece. That was an unusual piece for me, written a few months back. It was an op-ed, and I don't write op-eds because I don't think my readers care what I personally believe, who I vote for. But that was an op-ed that said, I live in Jerusalem. I was born in Jerusalem. I have two kids who were born in Jerusalem. They're going to school tomorrow morning. They speak Hebrew. They don't speak English. And they don't speak Arabic, and they don't speak the languages that the people who have these sort of moral narratives about Israel speak. They're ordinary human beings living in a society and a culture that doesn't realize even that all of these narratives are being told about them elsewhere in the world. So I think there's this really interesting engagement with Israel, and a very deep engagement, while at the same time it's not an engagement with a real Israel, with the actual human beings who compose this civilization, this society of millions of people that is the actual Israel. And so it's a fascinating sort of, we don't notice it because everybody's so sure they know what they're talking about. Israelis, by the way, too, everybody's so sure they understand exactly what everyone's talking about that we don't ask ourselves if we really do understand.
Well, and that actually reminds me of something that I heard an AP reporter in Israel once say years ago, and it was that, when other wire service reporters, he was talking about the way media works, are trying to cover these beats and no one's interested. He said in Israel, someone sneezes and all of a sudden everyone wants to hear from what's happening on the ground. And I think that fascination does come from that place that you're talking about there. But at the same time, despite all of the, hours and hours of radio time, of TV time, the inches and inches of newspaper print that are spent on Israel every day or every week, there still isn't an appreciation for the complexities that you're speaking of. So do you think that will ever change, or do you think that it should ever change for that matter?
I don't know if it will ever change. It's one of the I'm a political reporter, and the first thing you learn about politics when you actually start walking the halls of Parliament, any parliament in any democracy, is that people's politics don't really come from any rational place. People have intuitions. You intuit your moral beliefs, your political beliefs, which politician you trust and which one you don't. There are very few people out there who have a comprehensive understanding of the economics of healthcare. Many more people have strong opinions about healthcare. And that's because at the deepest level, by the way, this is everybody. The more you're convinced that you have rational reasons for thinking what your politics are correct, the more you're blind to how deeply intuitive those opinions actually are in terms of their sources. And that means that people generally believe what they believe. I hope that's not too obvious of a thing to say. But in other words, so people, when they talk about Israel, so let's say, activists, pro-Palestinian activists on college campuses in the United States, these are people I personally have encountered. And I've asked them questions that they have not been able to answer. Now, the Palestinians are under occupation by Israel according to Israeli law. And the question of how to end that occupation, what do we do with the Palestinians? We withdrew from Gaza and it turned into more bloodshed than when we were in Gaza. So can we withdraw from the West Bank safely? That question, I'm not saying Israelis are right or wrong in how they've dealt with the question, but it is the defining question of Israeli politics for a generation. Whether you're right-wing or left-wing in Israel has nothing to do with your views on the economy. It only has to do with your views on the Palestinians. And so if it's the defining question of our, culture, of our political culture, we have some questions that we want answered by, advocates on college campuses who are screaming to end the occupation. And one of our questions is the Palestinian Authority president of the West Bank, Mahmoud Abbas, is in the 10th year of a 4-year term. He won't call an election. And the reason he won't call an election is because he believes that, the jihadist Hamas is going to win that election in the West Bank. Now, how am I supposed to pull out of the West Bank? Now, I'm not saying maybe I'm immoral. Maybe I need to pull out of the West Bank. Maybe I deserve to take on that risk. But then argue that I deserve to take on that risk. Don't just argue that there's an occupation as if there's no context. When you ask these questions, when you challenge, there are challenges to the other side too. I'm not trying to defend any side on this issue. I'm just trying to say that when the people who yell about Israel on college campuses, the people who just opine, more politely about Israel, are not looking to self-criticize. They're not looking to uncover the truth. There's no sort of sense of, what am I getting wrong as the basic driving question of this exploration of Israel, and that's because they're invested in it. So, for example, President Obama, I believe, and I've written a little bit about it, and I believe that there's a good argument for saying this. I can't give it now in this short discussion, but I believe that President Obama is much, much angrier with Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel than he is with Vladimir Putin of Russia. Now, Vladimir Putin of Russia has probably ordered the assassination of journalists. Vladimir Putin invaded Crimea and is in a slow-motion invasion of eastern Ukraine. What he's doing in Russia, Obama has decided to roll with the punches, but he's upsetting the apple cart all over the world. He's an autocrat. Benjamin Netanyahu is none of those things. Benjamin Netanyahu will do anything he can to help America out at every level, at every strategic level. We're the only country that voted with the United States on Cuba in the UN vote last week. There were 2 countries that voted. The issue had to do with recognition of Cuba for a committee. It was the United States and Israel. And yet Benjamin Netanyahu hurts Obama and it frustrates Obama and angers Obama. And that has to do, I think, with narratives and emotional investment and not with any sort of objective sense. So we see evidence of this, and we, when you talk to any particular person advocating on any side, by the way, pro-Israel people as well, they have visions of Israel, and it's about holding sort of the line of identity rather than about, checking yourself and criticizing yourself. That's the nature of the discussion, I think, on all sides right now.
So what is the significance to Israel as a country and to Israeli people of support or even detractors abroad? And the reason I bring that up, and as you know, because you were there and we spoke about this a bit last week, I mean, Canadians who are pro-Israel, I include myself in that category, have had in the last decade a level of pride in that we had a prime minister who was very pro-Israel, and he was there at a time when the U.S. became seemingly less so. Does something like that matter, or is that just a feel-good thing for Canadians who are pro-Israel, or does that have any relevance to Israelis?
Well, feeling good is important. It's very important. Having a sense of a world that you want to live in, a world where your identity is respected, where your nationalism is respected, it is important to Israelis and to anybody, to Canadians, to every person alive. If Canada became a despised country in most of the world, that would be painful. But it's also not important in the strategic sense. In other words, there's this, for example, we talked about this a little bit when you were here. There's this campaign to delegitimize Israel. This idea that Israel is not a legitimate country, and therefore, I don't know what, it should turn off the lights and close its doors, and all the Israelis should ship back to the places they came from, which are Yemen, Morocco, Baghdad, Russia, those places.
Wow.
That's the campaign. Right? I don't even know what the logic is. But how do you delegitimize a country? You say something like, when you hear, you tell me, do you hear this sort of delegitimization of Israel as a campaign that's argument about whether Israel is legitimate? Israel is a civilization that speaks a language that no one else anywhere in the world speaks. It has 2 million school children. We have poets. We have evening news satire shows. We are a culture. We are a society. We're a civilization. We have a sense of national solidarity. We believe we are a nation, which is how nations come to be. Israel is not something you can delegitimize, right? So, for example, what does it mean if there's a global campaign to delegitimize Canada? It means that a lot of people don't like Canada, and it's unpleasant. But what's the strategic significance of delegitimizing Canada? Does Canada cease to exist? Does Canada evaporate? Do the millions of Canadian school children stop being Canadians? Do you know what I mean? What does it actually mean? So, in a sense, those who hate Israel and who are out campaigning against Israel are campaigning against this Israel in their own imaginations. They're campaigning against this sort of vision of Israel that they have, that they cling to because it tells them a story about their own identities and their own political identities. They're not really campaigning against the real Israel. You can't actually threaten us with Apartheid Israel Week. It's unpleasant to call us names. It's unpleasant, but there's a really deep, serious debate in Israel about how to end the occupation with the Palestinians. A profound debate. It's the main issue of every election in the last 30 years. You want to get into that debate? Come on in. It's not like that. It's a loud, boisterous debate. My paper, The Times of Israel, publishes that Hebrew-speaking debate in English. We publish in 5 languages: in English, Arabic, Chinese, French, and now in Persian. But if you want to delegitimize Israel, that's something that's not really sensical. I'll stop there because I think the point has gone across. But I'm not sure what support for Israel. Support for Israel is wonderful, and we love it, and it excites us, and it makes the national news in Israel. But it's not what saves us. What saves us are these sort of deeper inner strengths that we have. For example, we're a democracy. Our army is responsible to the parents of the soldiers back home, which means that our army tends to do better in battle than dictators' armies like the Syrian or the Egyptian army. So these are the things that are the real force multipliers of Israel. You're not going to defeat us by delegitimizing us any more than you could erase Canada by delegitimizing it. I think that's my argument.
And it's a very well put one. I'm afraid we have to take a break here, but I really do appreciate your time, not only this afternoon, but also last week. Haviv Rettig Gur joining me from the Times of Israel. Haviv, thank you very much, sir, and all the best to you.
Thank you.
And by the way, I feel compelled to point out one thing about that interview, which is that in Israel, the only place where the media is going to be pro-Israel, but even then, that's not a guarantee when you read some of the stuff they write in Haaretz. But I will say that it's refreshing to hear someone say, you know what, the support's nice, but it's irrelevant. And the reason that's comforting is because even though I like what we've heard in Canada from a lot of Israelis, that in one case I heard from someone who said that Canada is Israel's only friend in the world. So I like hearing that. It's nice to hear as a Canadian, but the alternative is inspiring as well. Because I do love Israel, because I am a Zionist, it's important for me to hear that Israel will be okay regardless. Even if every single country in the world were to stand up tomorrow in the United Nations and condemn Israel, it wouldn't make a difference because Israel exists on its own merits. Israel exists on its own laurels, and Israel knows how to do that and is pretty darn good at it. It's fascinating to me. Actually, not just one person, a lot of people were writing these nasty things about Israel and about me because I was going to Israel while I was there, and I've seen it in the days since as well. And one thing that stood out to me, and this isn't the most important thing about the country of Israel, about the state of Israel, but it stood out to me nonetheless, was the divide between the freedoms that people in Israel have and those in other parts of the Arab world. I saw one T-shirt that had a picture of the Hitler mustache twice, side by side. And on one of them, it had a silhouette of Hitler's hair, and on the other one, it had a silhouette of Charlie Chaplin's hat on top of it. And it said underneath it, "It's all about the hat." I wouldn't wear that shirt if you paid me to. Also, you saw in the Muslim quarter of Jerusalem's Old City, people really selling these virulently anti-Semitic T-shirts. You also have shirts praising Yasser Arafat. You have people selling shirts that say Free Gaza. And I've actually been to the West Bank. I actually went to Bethlehem, which is governed by the Palestinian Authority. And I can assure you, I did not see any Support Israel shirts for sale. I did not see any Israeli flags. I did see one, but it was not a very well-respected flag, I can assure you. Although I did see at a Palestinian store a Quebec flag for sale, which I found really interesting. I'll have to post a picture of that on Facebook. And that divide is so integral to understand because one country in the Middle East is a democracy, embraces freedom. One country does this. And that's the country that if aliens came to Earth would think was the biggest source of evil on this planet. When in actuality, it's a bastion and a beacon of light in, pardon the pun, a desert of despair. We've got to take a break here. When we come back, more Lawton Online on TheRebel.Media. Stay tuned.
You're listening to Lawton Online with your host, Andrew Lawton, exclusively on TheRebel.Media. Email your thoughts to Andrew at andrewlawton.ca or tweet Andrew using @AndrewLawton.
We are back here on Lawton Online on TheRebel.Media, and oh my goodness, do I have a doozy for you. Yes, indeed. Now, this is about the refugee quandary. We're still sticking with that branding, but it's a unique spin on it because this is one of these examples of where, and I predicted this on this podcast, I predicted it on social media, I predicted it in a column that I wrote, and I predicted it on my radio show, that the left, and that includes the mainstream media in this country, will become very disappointed when they realize that so many of the things they hated about Stephen Harper's PMO will not change under Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. And one of the biggest criticisms that Harper faced and Harper's staff faced was that it was closed off to the public, that it was very inward focused, is that it wasn't accessible, it wasn't attainable. There were limits on who could ask questions and how many questions they could ask and when and where they could ask questions, and he wouldn't hold press briefings and all that sort of stuff. And eventually his chickens came home to roost. I'm not going to lie. In this campaign, that strategy finally came to bite him in the butt because the campaign became about process rather than actual policy. But I will say, and this is something that I find to be incredibly interesting here, his strategy was effective. Prime Minister Harper's strategy was very much effective because he was able to, for the bulk of his time as Prime Minister, keep the message on track with what he wanted the message to be. And eventually, when so many people were talking about the alleged muzzling of scientists and people were talking about MPs not being able to speak openly and the offices that are all filtering through the PMO and all that sort of stuff, the criticism became too much. But I will say here, and I think this is something that needs to be acknowledged, it worked. Because for years and years, people were frustrated by what was happening in the press, but no one in the public really cared that much. No one in the public really felt like they were missing out on that much because they're still getting their stories no matter what. Well, I bring you to an article in the National Post that had me in stitches. And it's about the refugee crisis, but not about the refugee component of it. It's about the process behind it. Because the timeline, which I raised some issues with, and other people have raised issues with as well, makes us a little bit skeptical as Canadians, I think. Can they do it? And if so, how? And other people have been asking these same questions. A reporter was, for the National Post, Matthew Fisher was his name, looking into the timelines on this. He emailed an Immigration Canada spokesperson who responded and said, quote, "I have nothing to say to you at the moment," unquote, regarding the details of this, the timeline, etc. And he spoke to other sources as well. And this is a line from Matthew Fisher's piece in the National Post. "The officials did not want to be identified because diplomats and immigration officers have been told by Ottawa not to speak about the matter, with all requests referred to the government." So wait, just to clarify, is there muzzling of diplomats? Is there muzzling of public servants, muzzling of other government officials? Wait a minute. Is there a centralized power now, a centralized authority in the Prime Minister's office? Is there a centralized message control that's determining what the party line is on a certain issue? Such a thing could never happen, right? Oh, wait. It is. And I'm not outraged by this. No, I'm outraged at the hypocrisy, but I'm not outraged at the fact that there is one unified message coming out of the government, because when you're dealing with something like this, you can't have so many people trying to lead the pack here. But the list is going on and on of people that can't comment on what's happening. A spokesperson for the UN even has said, "I'm afraid I can't talk about Canada's program until we know more," so they don't know what's going on. Government officials with Immigration Canada saying, "Look, we can't talk about this. We don't know what's going on." Other unnamed diplomats and public servants in Canada's foreign relations telling media they can't comment either because the Prime Minister's office is the force to be reckoned with here. It's amazing that this took only a few weeks. This took only a few weeks before what is apparently an effective management strategy catches up with Justin Trudeau's Liberals here. And I'd love to say I told you so. In fact, I did just say I told you so, and I'm going to say I told you so again. I told you so. Now, I realize that a lot of you realize this, but we need to remind the other people about this. And I'm waiting for the heartbreak. I'm waiting for the public servants to stage their protest musicals. I'm waiting for people to fight back and say the government needs to be for the people, and this is wrong, and this is offensive. I'm waiting for the anger. It won't happen. This will become a question of, oh, well, what else was he supposed to do? Yeah, he had to do this. No, this is what a leader does. A leader's leading. This is Justin Trudeau leading. It's going to become like the new version of a proof is a proof, it's a proven. Well, no, he's leading. It's leadership. It's leading. He's leading. He's a leader. I'm not entirely convinced. So what is the answer to this problem? Nothing. He's going to brief the press when it's convenient. He's going to take his long walks from Parliament Hill, going all the way around to get to Langevin Block when he's going there. And he's going to do this when it's convenient, not when the you-know-what hits the fan. It's a podcast. I can say shit hits the fan. Not when the shit hits the fan. He's not going to take that long walk, letting reporters follow him all the way there when things are tough. He's not going to stand out in front of the press briefing room and talk directly to reporters when things are tough. He's going to do it when he has only his hair care products and dinner plans with the missus to talk about. In the meantime, I won't hold my breath for the petitions to end the muzzling of Canadian diplomats. More Lawton Online coming up in just a couple of moments. I'm Andrew Lawton. This is TheRebel.Media.
It's time for It Must Be a Liberal, only on Lawton Online. Scouring every corner of the globe for stories so outrageous, there must be a liberal involved.
Yes, you heard the man. It's time for It Must Be a Liberal, scouring every corner of the globe, from Kentucky to Kansas, from Kiribati to Kuwait, finding the stories so outrageous there must be a liberal involved. And today we actually go no further than the state just about an hour from me, which is that of Michigan, where a 25-year-old man was denied a job that he applied for in person at the Michigan Sheriff's Department. John Wesley Rose, a Kentucky native, oddly enough, because I used Kentucky in my preamble there, was trying to get a job with the Sheriff's Department. He appeared in person, but unfortunately, he neglected to recall that he was wanted on 6 sexual assault charges in his home state of Kentucky. And he agreed to get a background check for reasons I still don't quite understand. And in the process, they called him up, arrested him, and are now sending him back home to face the charges. Now, look, I think that in general, if you're evading search warrants or arrest warrants of any kind, you will inevitably have to pay the piper. I can't imagine wanting to live with always fearing the cops breaking down your front door. But my goodness, do people really need to make it so easy? I think it's safe to say that when you don't have the wherewithal to not apply for a police job and agree to a background check when you have outstanding sexual assault charges, I think it's safe to say you must be a liberal. There's really no other explanation for that. Folks, we've got to wrap things up for the program today, but do let me know if you want to hear a little bit more about Israel and what you want to hear. I had to have a huge notebook full of stuff that I won't be able to get through all of. Andrew@andrewlawton.ca is my email address. And folks, we will resume this little fun foray into the world of common sense in a world that needs it when we come back next week on TheRebel.Media. I'm Andrew Lawton. This is Lawton Online. Thanks for tuning in. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks for tuning in to Lawton Online. Check out TheRebel.Media for lots more fearless content and commentary.